If I'm hearing this right,
a lot of power in this, but
the notion of the face, if I'm hearing this right, it's almost for me it was the idea that you can project all kinds of negatives onto other people, but when you meet them, there's a face to face. If they're talking literally face to face, then that will change a lot of things that are going on in terms of relationship.
When you talk about that face, there is something that moves in us that generates that affiliative bond when we humanize the other. That is certainly, I think there is, and in lots of ways, there is something that when we begin to see the folks that we group together as an individual and have that individual connection, then something shifts and changes. So that there is this notion of the face. And so we talk and hear a lot about this notion of mentalization, and that the act of mentalization is turning to the face of the other and seeing their depth and complexity, finding a heartbeat in them. Right. And in moments of high emotionality, when our amygdala is going off like a car alarm and we find ourselves falling back into that fight, flight, or freeze, we don't think of subtleties of the other. We are either, we're actively attempting to be able to preserve ourselves or to preserve whatever parts, now that we can fight for ideas, trying to preserve those too. That's the idea of the face. And the second one is this notion of the light. And this is interesting. What I think this is sort of abbreviating the light of knowledge.
Oh, okay.
Because there is something about our capacity to understand, to learn, and to continue to grow in some ways. It's very important. And so that is a thing. So it's not only we have this visceral and almost primitive encounter with the other that generates this sense of connection. We have the capacity to begin to understand them and to understand ourselves. And that makes a big difference. And
that's sometimes we tend to panic, so I'm not really sure how we should manage all of this.
The place to start, there are a couple of places, and I think one of the things that makes this is that this is a global stressor. So that means that it is something we're all experiencing to some degree, but it also means something that if you're not careful, you can't take a break from. Right. Because one of the things we talk about as therapists is how to manage stress, and a big part of that is the ability to be able to step away from it, to give yourself a break and to self-care. It's if it is ubiquitous, if it is everywhere, like even we were talking about coming in today, I was able to find a really good parking spot out here when normally I got to park,
Right.
That's because, that there are signs everywhere that something's a little different. And I think the number one thing, and I've seen a number of folks say this, the first step is to take a break from the news.
Yeah. That's good advice. I'd actually heard that earlier, but not many people on the news are telling you to stay away from the news, because that's how they make their living. So that's kind of But one way is that's an obvious stressor because look, news is really about telling you all the bad things. It's not about happy butterflies, sun shining, flowers growing. There's none of that really. It's the horrors and the wrecks and the terrible stuff. Yeah, absolutely.
And there was a book that was published quite a while ago, and the author actually gave a talk here in Columbus, and it's Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, I think is the name of the book.
Interesting.
And the premise behind it's an interesting one is that if you were a zebra or there is potential predation all around you, but you still have to find a way to hang out, do your thing, with the idea that at any moment you could be killed and eaten. And
I see that. Yeah.
So what happens is with most animals is they have a sudden spike in stress, and it goes up and then it goes down. Right. So suddenly you're being pursued by a lion. The lion stops. You go back to being okay. And contemporary society is built. We're built in a place where our stressors aren't lions. Our stressors are taxes, and you mentioned 401ks. There are all these things. And these are things we can't run from. And once we're safe, we can't necessarily relax. So we have to be able to impose whatever breaks we can.
Sure.
We have to be able to step away and away, and we have to be cognizant and aware enough to do that. The zebra is on autopilot probably to this degree. There aren't too many Woody Allen-esque zebras.
Right.
Existential dilemmas.
The neurotic zebra. Okay, there's a concept.
Existential dilemmas don't loom for zebras. Probably, we don't know for sure, but they don't seem to fret in that sense.
No.
But
so spike up, come back down, down to normal. Okay, we don't have that so much because we're inundated with things.
And probably ours looks more like it grows and it stays. And our idea would be that we have to be generate a level of self-reflection for the possibility of self-care. How do we step away and breathe? What do we do? And we have to give ourselves permission to do that and have to be aware enough to do it. So I think that's one of the first things.
Oh, I think it's under threat. I really do.
Okay.
I think we have to be very concerned about that because I don't think we have balance of power any longer. Okay. I don't think we have the checks and balance system that you and I were raised to believe exists.
Right. I think it's one-sided or the other.
It's very much so. We're so polarized we don't work things out anymore.
We don't.
It's party before the people. And we have to go back to thinking about our people, not our party.
Right.
And we're so divided on that right now.
This has been a long time coming like this with the...
It has been.
With the way campaigns have been carried on, and state legislators are sort of dividing up counties into this thing, and the gerrymandering that's happened in so many different ways that now you've got a smaller group controlling everything.
Mm-hmm.
That's not democracy, is it?
No, and the whole gerrymandering thing is, again, that whole push where the party in power wants to stay in power.
Yes, they do.
So they're making it so groups that, even if they outnumber them, can't get control.
Right.
And it also goes back with voter suppression.
Right.
And we're seeing a lot of voter suppression.
We're right here
especially
in the state.
Right here in the South, where
Georgia
we've done that, and we said everybody's got to get their gold ID, so the gold star on their ID so they can vote. And
one thing I heard the other day on a news program was that if you signed your name this time different than, and say you had an initial, you left initial out,
it doesn't
they
count.
throw your ballot out.
Yeah,
right?
That kind of thing. And then also we're getting, so the talk is, because remember, this is a census year.
Right.
And we're seeing some suppression of true census taking, where you have some states that are putting no money into it because they don't want certain groups represented.
Yes.
They don't want them counted. Remember, your current administration tried to do this by putting in a question on citizenship because they knew it would scare people and would keep them from identifying themselves.
So we don't get the actual fact.
We don't
of
want the
what
facts.
the numbers are.
And remember, it's extremely important we get an accurate count, because that way
Yeah, it is.
people are represented. Where are the population shifts? Those people need to be represented.
Oh, it's nothing like humor, and good to understand.
Wait, but maybe this is takeaway
Wait,
with
what?
this. This
All
is
right,
going to
go.
be the takeaway.
All
with
right,
this.
come back.
Because for one thing, we want to be able to, the takeaway is that what I think is important about articles like this is they show the possibility of hope, that there is something about us that we often have to find a way to mediate, to confront, do something with, and we're certainly amiss and things can go horribly awry if we don't do that. But it's possible, and that we have the capacity to continue to grow as a species. We still have the capacity to be able to do something with the world that we're in. It looks grimmer and grimmer that we're headed towards some problems that we've created. But there's the possibility, both as an individual and as a group, that we could do things differently. And maybe that you start as an individual.
Right.
How do you move throughout your day that you are aware of the people around you? How do you move throughout your day that you listen to yourself and you're open to the things that you might learn? And how often do you laugh? Those are, that's not a bad recipe for making it through a day and maybe even building a life on.
Hey, I like that. I don't think we can expound upon too much more than that, but give it a try. All right, Dan, it's been fun. We'll see you next time.
Well, you mentioned self-psychology because, the way self-psychology talks about this is that the self is sort of it is something, you can sort of define we have to define the self. And from a self-psychological perspective, there is the brain, and then there's the mind. And the mind is an emergent property of the brain.
Okay.
And the self is a system that it's an emergent property of the mind in context with other selves. So there are sort of layers to this. When you talk
Right.
about self from a self-psychological perspective, it is in the self system requires constant maintenance. We have to be able to do something with ourselves. We have to maintain. Coat talked about it has to have rigor. It has to stay cohesive.
Right.
And so there are all these ways that we manage our self states to maintain some level of cohesion. And sometimes to manage those self states, we have to be selfish. And that's
Right.
when we are using the people around us to help us as self objects. They can serve different purposes. There are what he called mirror self objects, where people will reflect back to us things that we need to see. Idealized self objects. People we have to look up to. They need to be ideals that we move toward. Twinship, where we can see that we have a lot in common. There are a couple of others too, but these are all ways in which we can sort of make use of the people around us to maintain some form of self-cohesion, to feel, and cohesion can be defined as a sense of who you are across time.
Okay.
Right.
Some consistency of who we
Right,
are.
yeah.
So we wake up in the morning, we know about our history, who we were
Right, we
before.
can feel, and that throughout the day we're often generated what are known as not me states, parts of us that are parts of us, but we're Lacan would call them extimate. They are part of us, but they feel external or they feel alien to who we are. And so those also have to be managed, and they're often managed through projection or projective introjection, you don't want to acknowledge some of your own anger, instead you'll see it in the eyes of someone else. And that's a way of also managing this self-system.
we have to be aware of so that we're not losing every time we see someone else doing something more fun. Or
Well, this could be the
having a better
mental health
situation.
takeaway from this. This could be if we need to have a bit of self-help for this. Some
Yeah.
way to think about this is that if we think about those two levels of anxiety, in some ways, they really coincide. What may be happening when I'm sitting there at the pool is our nervous systems attempt to be able to generate a what's called the euthymic window, and we try to be able to maintain a certain level of balance where you're not feeling too much or too little. And so you're trying, based on your genetic loading and your developmental history, our euthymic windows can be both, in context, they can be broader and narrow. So folks who are, quote, happy may have a broader euthymic window.
Okay.
But even as I'm sitting there by the pool, I'm having to navigate and mediate hunger, the need for elimination, all sorts of biological processes that directly and indirectly affect my psyche. And so we are always attempting to be able to maintain our equilibrium within that euthymic window. So even as I'm sitting there, the reason I picked the phone up may have been an attempt at some sort of balancing.
Okay.
Right? So the goal would be is how do we, and this is maybe something we can talk about in depth at another place, because something
Sure.
really interests me, the difference between emotional regulation and emotional modulation.
Okay.
Emotional regulation, heroin, cutting, restricting food intake, those are all forms of emotional regulation. They regulate emotion. A healthy response is modulation. So what if, while I'm sitting there at the pool, I attempt to regulate by grabbing my phone and going on Facebook? I'm distracting myself from both my internal and my external surround in such a way that I'm not necessarily directly dealing with the things that I could deal with in the most healthy way. A modulation, as opposed to a regulatory activity, could be to simply take a breath and start to name and allow myself to experience in the moment the things that are going on, to listen to the sound of the pool, think about the sun as it hits me, to be able to look at my house and my pool, to think about where I've been, where I'm at, where I'm going. Those are moments of meeting with the here and now. It's a meeting with the now that you can find only in an act of modulation, and they're often missing in an act of regulation. The problem often is that, like it or not, there are lots of crayons in the crayon box.
Oh.
And your capacity to be able to color with as many of them as possible probably is more indicative of your capacity to have a balanced and well-lived life.
Okay.
Some of us may be lucky enough. I mean, there's even the story of the Buddha where his family tried to keep him completely free of any suffering, so he never left the palace, had everything he wanted, and whatnot.
Right.
So that there's even in the myth or the story, the fable.
Kind of like
is
a
that
parenting style a little bit there for some, but
they
yeah,
gave him
yeah.
everything.
Right.
But still, suffering found a way to find him, And I think, and the goal would be, how does one become better and better equipped to deal with the natural emotional contingencies that come with just life? And as you may know this, the feelings that you have when you're 18 can be different than the feelings you have when you're 50.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is an ever-changing landscape. And so it's never something we can completely solve, because there's always something shifting, both broadly and narrowly. And so our goal is, how do we find a way to be able to live with the things that we're continually given? And a big chunk of that is some degree of suffering. And nothing could make you suffer more if you think you're supposed to be living the life you see in a truck commercial.
Right. Well, I was almost thinking of just about any commercial these days. When it's medicine, you have a terrible medical problem, but people are sort of bounding through the wheat field with the sun shining, and everybody's happy, and all the models.
That's your
are,
idea of what life would be. You are going to be, at best, frustrated by what you're going to receive. At worst, devastated by the fact that it may be like that in
didn't
some
fix it.
Yeah, and it may be like that at moments. There are moments of pure joy and exultation that come from just, there are. They're there.
Let's go with
But-
a couple of those. How about that? Well,
They
I think
usually involve drugs. I'm just saying.
well, the marketing problem I think we're coming up against that it's been painted at almost anything you're trying to sell on the television or any media platform. It's got all these wonderful, happy moments and people smiling and talking, and everything is happy in that regard, and you can sell more products. So we may be just victims of this commercialism, and as you've talked about earlier.
Well, how we may be victimized in ways, it may keep us further from the sort of skills and investment in our life that may be necessary for us to have some level of at least temporary contentment and to grow. Before I was going to bed last night, I was reading Roger Scruton. Anybody here a Roger Scruton fan?
No, sorry.
He was probably the foremost conservative thinker, certainly in philosophy and in a number of things. And as you know, I'm a commie lefty. But I've long ago
And
made.
we still let you in the studio.
That's good, yeah.
Okay.
But long ago, I said to myself, I can only be a comedy. That's a.
That was a good.
That's a Freudian slip.
There we go.
I could only be a commie lefty if at least 10% of the books I read had to be completely opposite of what I believe.
Okay.
And quickly I found that some of those made me want to jump out a window. But I found people like Scruton and folks like that who I may disagree with them, but they can articulate and they can challenge me to think in some ways. And so I've read a good bit of Scruton.
Oh, my
And,
friend, that is. I'm glad you had that balance there. But there are people who have never heard the opposite of their beliefs. They never heard any contradictions to the other side, and it seems to be in this. Dr. Hackett and I talked about earlier this notion of this have and have-nots and the differences and the political differences and the siding.
Well,
one
they talk
side
about
or the other.
the bubbles that we live in.
Right.